It isn't an understatement to say that we are deeply, deeply divided as a nation. Polarized and paralyzed is a phrase I've heard recently. Unfortunately, political rancor isn't anything new. One of the things that Jerry and I have been doing to entertain ourselves during the coronavirus confinement is to watch some great courses. And we are currently watching one called Turning Points in American History. One of the sessions that we watched this week was about the election of 1800. That is the election that was the topic of the Broadway musical Hamilton. And despite the musical's popularity and the infamous duel, of course, between Hamilton and Aaron Burr, we were really unaware of the vicious factionalism of that election. A partisan press emerged, imagine that, with newspapers printing malicious lies about their opponents, the fake news of that day. Jerry and I just looked at each other and said, "What's new? It sounds like 2020. As much as we may think that there has never been a time like this before, history tells us differently. What is your reaction to conflict? The political conflict we are immersed in, and the personal conflicts that are an inevitable part of human relationships. Most of us experience conflict as threat, and we have either the flight or fight response. What is your reaction when you listen to political candidates or commentators attack one another? Some of us get angry, worked up, energized to get out and do something. Some of us get uncomfortable, weary, and just want it all to go away. Conflict resolution is pretty much a required course these days, whatever your field of endeavor. It's interesting to me that a lot of the more recent books on this topic call it conflict management. Maybe they've given up on resolution, I don't know. But we all encounter conflict all the time. In our families, at work, at school, certainly in politics, and yes, even in the church. It is the human condition and has been since the beginning of time. Those who study the topic have identified 5 basic approaches or strategies or responses to dealing with conflict. Listen to them and think about which might characterize you. One is avoidance, just refusing to deal with an issue. We might withdraw from the situation, sidestep the issue, change the topic, or tell ourselves that we'll deal with it later. Another is accommodation, giving up our own concerns to diffuse the conflict and satisfy the concerns of the other. And we tell ourselves that accommodation is generous and selfless, even when the actions of another are causing pain and suffering. The other side of accommodation is competition, pursuing what we are convinced is right, even at the expense of the other side. A fourth approach is compromise, trying to find a mutually acceptable solution, each party giving up something, but keeping something as well, sort of splitting the difference. And finally, there is collaboration, working together to create something new, a third way that fully satisfies both sides, a true win-win. So, where do you find yourself? How do you tend to deal with conflict? How does your family or your workplace or Congress, whatever our tendency, it's helpful to remember that we have options. Jesus had his own course on how to deal with conflict, and that's our best option. Matthew's community was apparently struggling with disputes. And so Matthew drew together some of Jesus' teachings about community to guide them, and they can guide us. Chapter 18 is all about how we live together despite our differences. And while Matthew refers to church members, Jesus didn't use the word church much. And Jesus' view of community and family is much, much broader. More important, the way Jesus' followers deal with conflict is to be a model and a witness for the world. So Matthew begins in chapter 18, before our passage today, by reminding us that in Jesus' community, there is no hierarchy. There's no one at the top with executive orders. When the disciples asked Jesus about who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven, he puts a child in their midst, and he talks about the little ones, representing the vulnerable and those with no authority or status. And then he goes on to warn them at all costs to avoid harming these little ones, putting stumbling blocks in their paths. He follows that up with the story of the lost sheep, emphasizing to them the value of each person and encouraging them to keep vigilant care for one another. Now, if we did all those things, we might not have so much conflict, but we inevitably continue to act in ways that hurt one another and perpetuate injustice and suffering. So Jesus goes on in today's gospel passage, and he teaches, first of all, that love requires that we address conflicts. As we hear in many protests today, silence is not an option. When there is a rupture in relationships, Jesus says, go. It is our responsibility to take the initiative to heal and restore when there's conflict. That is what being a follower of Christ is all about. Jesus tells us, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. They will be my sisters and brothers." And Paul, who had his own share of conflicts, wrote, "God in Christ was reconciling the world to himself, not counting their trespasses, their offenses against them, and entrusting to us that same ministry of reconciliation." Reconciliation requires honest dialogue, caring conversation that doesn't accuse or attack, and careful listening. The goal of these conversations isn't convincing the other side that they are wrong and we are right. It is seeking to understand and find common ground. We also have a responsibility to go with and walk alongside others who are being disempowered or made vulnerable, who are not listened to or given voice. There is a sad and unfortunate history of using a passage such as this to justify excluding, to excommunicate rather than to reconcile. But we are bound to those with whom we disagree, whether we like it or not. Even the church isn't a voluntary association of autonomous individuals. It is one body. And we can't say to one another, "I have no need of you," even when we disagree. Considering someone to be as a Gentile or a tax collector doesn't absolve us from reconciling. And it doesn't exclude them from God's family. It only doubles our commitment and responsibility to them. For it is to them that Jesus reached out. This passage isn't a formula of steps to undertake, but rather it's a description of the lengths to which we must go, not to lose anyone. Reconciliation is about our humbly seeing one another as vulnerable little ones, each deserving our care and compassion. It is about listening rather than judging, about loving even our enemies with a love that is bigger than our differences. And it is about boundless forgiveness. If we go on and read further in chapter 18, Peter's going to ask Jesus how many times he must forgive. Wrong question. Forgiveness isn't something we do that we can count. It is who we are and the way we live, or at least who in Christ we can be. To be honest, this is one of those times when I wonder if I can really practice what I am preaching. I would much prefer to avoid conflict if I could. Arguments tie my stomach in knots. And frankly, there are people and groups I would rather not be associated with than reconciled to. Of course, those are the folks that Jesus hung out with. But I know that to do the work of reconciliation, I need a change of heart. Reconciliation is hard, but it is our work to do as followers of Christ. And God's love compels us to undertake it. Gratefully, we aren't on our own. Jesus assures us that when we are about this work, he is always with us, supporting and encouraging and blessing our efforts. And if we want a change of heart, if we want to draw close to Christ, this is the path to doing it. The promise and the potential of reconciliation, of really healing our divisions and coming together, is incredible. Where two or three differing people or positions or parties are joined together, God is powerfully at work. And what seems impossible becomes possible. When we bind ourselves to one another, even to those with whom we disagree, and together we bind ourselves to something bigger than ourselves, we loose the power of love to bring about God's kingdom here on earth as it is in heaven.